To understand why it's popular among the chattering classes to trash Canada around Canada Day, it helps to understand the power of utopian movements in history. Historically, utopian movements were found in religious traditions or in ideological movements that were secular, such as Marxism. An example from a religious tradition might be where folk form a commune or even a cult, or just separate themselves out from mainstream society on the belief that the world is impure while they are pure or want to be pure. On the secular varieties of this, you see movements such as Marxism in 1917 in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, or Pol Pot's Cambodia, or Mao under China, or Ukraine under the rule of Joseph Stalin, where collectivization was forcibly imposed. This was done with an end to a vision, perfect economic equality. They were headed towards a utopia, or at least they thought they were. Now, these utopian movements were often wrong. You couldn't create a perfect world in the future. You might be able to improve it at the margins. But these utopian movements at least look to the future. The future, by definition, has not been created yet. Today, you have people who look to the past and take almost a utopian approach to it. They look to 1867 and say John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, and ask why he didn't hold the views we do today, or why he enacted policies different than what we would consider acceptable today. In essence, they have a utopian standard for the past, and the past, by definition, can't be changed. At least previous generations of utopians thought they could change the future, create a heaven on earth, that sort of thing. This in part explains why some are so critical of Canada today. But it's a mistake. It's a mistake for a number of reasons. The evils that we look back in human history, and that we now agree are evil, were once considered routine and unremarkable. And the interesting question is how we moved away from them, not the fact that they occurred. A good example is slavery. Slavery was once routine in the ancient world, and in fact until recent centuries. Almost every society practiced slavery, and it occurred in places as diverse as Asia, Africa, the Americas before European and British contact. It also even occurred in Europe, where slave traders from North Africa would go to what we now know as nations far north as Iceland, but the British Isles, or the Spanish coasts, and extract slaves and bring them to North Africa. 1 million Europeans, according to one account of slavery. So slavery was once routine. The more interesting question is why it was abolished. In Canada, early pre-Confederation politicians and governors, British governors, took their cue from William Wilberforce, a British parliamentarian animated by his own evangelical Christian faith. That's one reason why slavery was abolished, and in fact with the help of the muscle, so to speak, of the British Empire after 1833, which outlawed slavery in the empire, the British Empire did, but then also attempted to suppress the slave trade around the world wherever a British naval ship found slave traders. That's one example of where Canada was ahead of the curve, abolishing slavery in practical effect by 1820. About 50 years ahead of the United States, for example. Some nations didn't abolish slavery until the 20th century. In the early 20th century, that included China, Malaysia, Morocco, Turkey, and Kuwait. The last nations to abolish slavery didn't do so until later in the 20th century. That included nations such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, or Oman and Mauritania, which respectively didn't abolish slavery in law until 1970 and 1981. Or ponder the emancipation of women. New Zealand was the first country to grant women the vote in 1893. Canada did so in 1917, federally. Some nations, even in the West, didn't grant suffrage the right to vote until much later. France in 1944, China in 1949, India in 1950. It took Kuwait until 2005, and Saudi Arabia didn't grant women the right to vote, and only in municipal elections, in 2015. Lastly, consider the treatment of minorities. The unremarkable thing, tragic as it is about history, is that it's always been the case that nations and governments and potentates and dictators and kings and queens discriminated against minorities, however defined, sometimes religiously, sometimes based on color, sometimes based on a different ethnicity or a different nationality. Again, the more interesting question, or the more remarkable development, is that we got away from that and began to treat people as individuals, with rights in law and policy as individuals. A good example is the province of Ontario, which banned discrimination based on ethnicity, based on color, based on gender in the early 1950s, in employment and in housing, in accommodation, i.e. renting a hotel room. It wasn't legal after the early 1950s in that province to discriminate against someone based on their color if they wanted to rent your motel room, for example. That was a positive development, but that took place 70 years ago. These days, there are some countries that still discriminate against someone based on gender or ethnicity or race. One example comes from Egypt, where Amnesty International recently wrote this about Egypt. In early 2021, the Egyptian cabinet referred a new draft personal status law to Parliament, which retained discriminatory provisions against women in relation to marriage, divorce, child custody, and education. There are many reasons to celebrate Canada on Canada Day this year. Don't let the utopian thinkers who look to the past and wonder why it wasn't perfect take away from the fact that Canada was ahead of the curve on many measurements: the abolition of slavery, the treatment of women, the treatment of minorities. Don't let those who look at the past and think it should have been perfect keep you from celebrating what is a tremendous accomplishment: Canada since 1867.